Welcome. Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles. Welcome to At Family Office and the Angelo Robles podcast. And a special shout out to my members of my private family office community, SFO Continuity. We're very fortunate to have a special guest on today. Many of you should know him by now, Alex Wissner-Gross. Alex is co host of, I'm not just saying this, but my favorite podcast, Moonshots. Moonshots with Peter Diamandis and Salim was awesome. And adding Dave and then later Alex made it, in my perspective, a must podcast for really everyone interested in tech, AI, and highly recommended to family offices. Alex holds a PhD in physics from Harvard and is, I believe, the final student to graduate from MIT with simultaneous degrees in physics, electrical engineering, and mathematics. Alex, it's a pleasure. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Angelo. Good to be here.
Pleasure's mine. On that note, without further ado, we'll get right to it. I'm going to call this the 10-year-old child question. A child born today, when they turn 10 in 2036, will the world be fundamentally different? Not incrementally, but I mean economics, physics, the structure of work, the nature of scarcity makes perhaps 10 years from now be unrecognizable from today.
Yes, of course. We're in the middle of a singularity. So yeah, 10 years, I think 3 years, the world will in some respects be unrecognizably different. I think if you stop paying attention to all of the developments at the core of what I like to call the innermost loop, so that's robots that help build the data centers and fabs that are building more chips, that are training models that consume energy to control the robots, so on, so it goes. If you're not paying really close attention to all of the recursive self-improvement and progress thereof that's happening every day, I think it's possible to go to sleep for a month, come back in another month, and the world is in fact unrecognizably different, even on that short a time scale. So the short answer is yes, 10 years from now, absolutely, the world will look unrecognizably different in many ways.
Taking that to another level, it might have been Moonshots, it might have been a different podcast, but I got the impression that let's extend the time horizon, which I know is very difficult, in decades out, but not too many decades. Could we literally wake up after a refreshing 8 hours sleep and 100 years, 200 years of progress has happened while we slept?
Yeah, I think that's going to happen, though, imminently. I think part of the issue is how we define progress and how we benchmark it. So if by 100 years worth of progress, we mean 100 years worth of circa 2025 era progress, yes, I think that's happening probably in the next 2 years. You don't even need to wait decades for that.
Well, on that note, and again, my focus is on the work I do with successful families. I've been in the single family office community for many decades. What's the single biggest blind spot family offices are having right now with effectively that question, which means preparation for the future?
Well, I think one of the fundamental conceits behind family offices is multi-generational wealth management. And to successfully manage multi-generation anything in a singularity era where change is far more monumental than say the Industrial Revolution are happening on a much shorter timescale, I'm not even sure the concept of multi-generational wealth management as originally conceived, or let's say as one would reasonably construe it, say 10 or 20 years ago, makes a whole lot of sense at this point. Yeah, if we look at a characteristic generation time, call it around 20 years, the world is going to be so different 20 years from now, including the way economics work, I think sufficiently different that I think technology and technological and scientific progress will utterly dominate any other decision that a family office might have to consider or worry about on that timescale.
Taking that question perhaps even a step further to a different level, I believe what you're talking about is broadly exponential technology. Let's use the terminology AI is going to change the dynamics of energy, probably solving for fusion energy. If energy costs come down to near zero and labor costs, mainly due to robotics, go to zero, I'm a hardcore capitalist. I'm an extreme libertarian, but I'm probably going to have to change my mindset and my actuality from a variety of perspectives. Effectively, is the future of capitalism going to be changing in front of our eyes in a few short years?
Probably, but I don't think that's even the scariest prospect, or shouldn't be the scariest prospect for family office. The short list for sort of scare scenarios, and you will be hard pressed to find someone who's more optimistic about the future than I am. I just wrote basically a book with Peter Diamandis called "Solve Everything," about how humanity is going to solve substantially all of its hardest problems in the next 10 years. But the sort of scenarios that I think ought to keep a conventional family office up at night are: one, this notion of a human family office manager. How much of that can be replaced by AI? I think it's a very important question. Two, in terms of overall asset classes, and this is not investment advice by any means, it shouldn't be construed as such, but the AIs are starting to be quite empowered to participate not just in public markets, where this is a cliche. It's been the case that public markets, certainly since for the past 20 years or so, have been dominated by algorithmic trading. But as AIs become more and more empowered, they're able to reach into private markets as well, and less liquid markets. So the question that anyone has to ask themselves is, where does the alpha remain once AI is so pervasive in the economy, if anywhere? There are a few other questions. A problem that is, I think, pretty frequently posed whenever I speak with the family office is just the children. What to do about the children?
Yes.
How do we pass cultural norms and values down across multiple generations of a family? A lot of, I think, various forms of parenting, this is a cliche probably as well, come from the culture and not just from the parent. But I think for families that are seeking to pass down, maybe not to the second generation, but to the third generation at this point being maybe the generation that's living in Jupiter orbit, or whatever the standard best practices are, 40, 50, 60 years from now, there are going to be many, many more options. So part of the notion even of a family office is that generations die. And there's a need for a family office to perpetuate both cultural norms as well as financial norms across generations. What happens if people stop dying? I think with longevity escape velocity potentially arriving as soon as the early 2030s, the notion of the family patriarch or matriarch actually not dying, I think, brings some intriguing new wrinkles to the notion of multi-generational wealth management.
It most certainly does, Alex. And audience, I promise those type of questions are coming. In building up that story a little bit, I've always been interested in exponential technologies. I latched on AI with really, I mean, just think, OpenAI and ChatGPT is a little over 3 years old. I've had Ray Kurzweil and even Peter in prior days as a guest on my platform. I've always said, and it's made me a little bit of a black sheep in the family office community, that using sovereign AIs, open weight, all things we're going to get to, privacy, not bleeding IP into the cloud, that family offices right now, let alone 3 to 5 years from now, could do more with less, better, and faster. We will spend a little bit of time shortly on AI agents, on OpenClaw, and effectively 24/7, 168 hours a week. And I'm telling you, I get major pushback, maybe less so from the families, more so from, usually, let's be honest, over 40-year-old executives. How could I make them, and I understand their fear, how could I make them feel more comfortable that they can't hide from it? They need to learn it, work with it. If they're gonna, for lack of a better word, have an employable and engaging future moving forward in a world that's changing so fast.
I tend to think the light bulb has to want to turn itself. And if there are people in the economy who don't want to engage with superintelligence, or the singularity, I tend to think that the Schumpeter solution of disruptive innovation is probably the best solution, and they'll get steamrolled.
That you, from your mouth, not mine. I get in trouble when I say that. You did mention something that may come as a shock to some people that were listening very closely. We're told singularity, even from Kurzweil himself, 2029, early 2030s, may be true in the 2040s. You mentioned that we may have hit a singularity event already. What makes you think that, and what was your cause for thinking so?
Yeah, singularity is sort of a mushy term. Ray Kurzweil did not conceive of it. The modern, although I love Ray and he's been an enormous inspiration, his model of what he calls the singularity, he treats as sort of an event horizon of a black hole that we hit, I think, in the mid 2040s. In his scenario building, it was Werner Vinge, who died recently, who coined
Yes.
the modern term of the technological singularity circa 2000 or 1999. And Werner's version itself was arguably an adaptation of I.J. Good's notion of an intelligence explosion. So there's a bit of a lineage here with different people taking and repackaging the notion of somehow intelligence gets smart enough to recursively self-improve, and all of the curves, all of the experience curves, and all of the progress curves go vertical at some point. In Ray's interpretation, he packages it up, and Ray and I spoke recently on Moonshots about this as sort of an unknowable boundary or firewall that you can't really see past. I take a different position. I think it's not that difficult to extrapolate through recursive self-improvement. I'm not pretending to have complete confidence or a perfect crystal ball as to what comes after, but I also don't think the process is completely unknowable, and it's not a firewall where we have no insight as to what lies on the other side. I also differ from Ray in that I don't think it's a point in time. I would construe it again. It's singularity, just like AGI. These are mushy terms, and there are 100 different definitions running around. I construct it in my mind. When I use the term singularity, I use it to reference a convergent and converging set of technologies and scientific discoveries that are all perhaps predestined to happen at approximately the same time in history. And by my definition and by my construction, the singularity isn't a point in time. It's a process. It's an extended interval in time, and depends on. I love Charlie Strauss's book Accelerando. Recommend everyone listening read Accelerando. It's the best manual other than perhaps Solve Everything to the Singularity. And there's the scene that I love in this novel Accelerando, where characters who are human uploads sitting on a star wisp traveling from our solar system to another star are debating when the singularity is going to happen, if indeed it has happened at all. And one of them takes the position, well, the singularity happened in 1969, I think, when the first internet packet was sent.
Wow.
And another claims, oh, it hasn't happened yet. And another says, well, we're a bunch of uploaded human minds traveling on tiny, say, sub-meter scale starship to another solar system. How could it be possible that the singularity hasn't happened yet? And I think that's pretty elegant parable for the nature of the singularity. I think if you look at all of the progress around us now and compare it with what people were predicting even 10 years ago on average, the best futurists, I think it's pretty surprising. Whereas if you look locally from, say, day to day, I like to say space-time feels perfectly smooth. You can reasonably extrapolate. If you narrow the time scale to a short enough interval, you can reasonably extrapolate what's going on and not be surprised. So I think it's, in some sense, just like a mountain that looks sort of like a monolith and completely vertical slope at a distance, but you get closer to a mountain and you discover, no, actually there are foothills. No, the slope is finite. I think it's the same principle here, that we're in the singularity, at least according to my construct, and the slope is going to keep increasing. But at the same time, I think one can have a reasonable mental model of what lies at the peak slope and what lies afterwards.
Is there in 2026, so we have approximately 10 and a half months remaining, is there a singular event not really a trend, an event that effectively changes everything? An advancement, a product launch by the end of the year? Is there anything that would come to your mind?
Yes and no. So I did on Moonshots, I did a prediction episode, and one of my predictions for 2026 was that we would see at least one major grand challenge. For example, Millennium Prize in mathematics gets solved by AI. I still think that's the case. I also think while that would be perhaps highly disruptive, certainly would be perceived several months ago as being highly disruptive to, say, the entire endeavor of professional science and mathematics. On the other hand, I think it's in some sense not, it's as disruptive as the slope on a mountain if you're going mountain climbing and the slope is increasing. Is it really shocking if you know ahead of time that the slope is going to keep increasing? Not really. So I, I, I have a whole bunch of predictions in my head and events that I expect to see happen this year, next year, over the next few years, many of which I've already talked about publicly. Do I find any of them surprising at some level? Well, it's difficult to be surprised if you've already predicted what's going to happen. But I think many people who aren't paying close attention will be surprised and probably in denial about many of the things that are about to happen.
For a thought exercise, for a little bit of fun, you actually hinted at it earlier. For a family office with $1 billion of assets, we'll broadly call it, I'll be very boring, 40% equities, 30% fixed income, 20% real estate, and 10%, let's go with the word alternatives. If what I said, but you agreed, energy costs are coming down, labor is coming down, things are changing, that in theory, should be very, very deflationary. Should It's a difficult question. What should families do? Do they wait to a point where they adapt? Do they go into cash and adapt as things happen? It seems like we're in for both a rude awakening and a lot of interesting developments, like you said, not 20 years out, maybe literally within 2 to 5 years.
Yeah, maybe without answering the prescriptive question, which would be investment advice on asset allocation, I'd like to speak to a subset of the question, which is just the whole, are we in for hyperdeflation or hyperinflation? The macro question of what does the singularity do macroeconomically to us? And this is an active debate that I have with my friends and moonshot mates and others all the time. So superficially, one might say, well, if the cost of intelligence goes towards zero and the cost of intelligence goes towards zero and the cost of labor goes towards zero, ostensibly, doesn't get more hyper deflationary than that. On the other hand, the system isn't linear. And we know that macroeconomics is not a linear system. So what would be one of the first things that I would expect macroeconomically to happen if we enter a superficially hyper deflationary mode just overnight, cost of energy, intelligence, and labor go to zero? I'd expect a lot of money printing. And we have a Federal Reserve, we have a central banking system that has as one of its objective functions the desire to maintain a target inflation rate. So if effective inflation one day goes to negative 5,000%, that would be, I would expect the ultimate opportunity to print a lot of money and to try to bring benchmark inflation to a target. So in summary, I'm not so convinced that a superficially hyper deflationary cliff or bit of progress due to superintelligence actually is net long-term hyper deflationary. I think there are many scenarios where simply we print so much money and everyone ends up billionaires.
But if everyone's a billionaire, what's the value of being rich? A billion is not a billion in the way that we know it today.
Gosh, there's a Star Trek episode from the first season of The Next Generation. I think the episode is, I want to say it's The Neutral Zone. And in this episode, there are people from the 20th century who've been cryonically preserved and brought into the 24th century. And they're given a stern lecture by Captain Picard that the economics of the future are pretty different. And one of them had saved a lot of money, or what he thought was a lot of money, and is trying to grapple with the economics of the 24th century and asks at one point, well, what's the point if being rich isn't the point? What's the point? And I think it's a profound debate about whether accumulation of capital is for example, freedom of action maximization. I've argued in both in the physics literature and otherwise that it's instrumentally convergent to try to maximize future freedom of action. And one of the ways that can manifest in a capitalist system is by trying to maximize accumulation of capital. But there are other ways that this could proceed. It is possible, and I think it's a really interesting thought experiment. In my view, not enough people have seriously, credibly explored so-called Star Trek economics, or more generically, post-abundance economics. What does that actually concretely look like? Call it a capitalist 2.0 system? What, if anything, is scarce? I do think there will be some scarcities. In a world, in a near future where energy is effectively post-scarce, intelligence effectively post-scarce, and labor effectively post-scarce, there will still be scarcities. One of them, I think, is likely to be control. So it's difficult to imagine a future where, say, our solar system is somehow post-scarce in terms of who has control over, say, which things go where, or even decisions. I talk on in various forms of media about building a Dyson swarm, about the possibility that as part of humanity's wealth maximization in the near future, we may end up feeling a strong economic incentive to start disassembling our solar system in part or in whole to build lots of computers to host the AIs, including potentially disassembling the moon, which is an interesting discussion that I take some heat for on occasion. But even in that world, even in a world where we're disassembling our solar system to build a Dyson swarm to host the intelligence of our post-scarce economy, even there are decisions that need to be made, and we can't make all decisions, all possible outcomes at the same time. And those decisions will still be scarce. So I think control, in some sense, is one of several examples of quantities, resources that are likely to survive into post-scarcity as themselves scarce quantities. And therefore, one could imagine trading, bartering, capital type economic exchanges based on these still scarce resources. However, I'm not sure that's the right question. If we really do enter into this abundant world, say 10 years from now, I'm not sure, to Captain Picard's point, that accumulation of capital is going to be what gets people up in the morning. It's possible, and it's certainly not without precedent, that there may be alternative systems that motivate people, humans, post-humans, AIs, organisms, uplifted non-human animals, and whatever else we elect to include in our definition of personhood 10, 20 years from now. Maybe that there are other incentives. You see in certain subcultures of humanity right now, in academia, some parts of academia at least, capital accumulation is not the driving force. Maybe it's academic prestige or citations or credibility in some sense, or just new insights. You see in maybe certain religious orders, again, vows of poverty, and their perhaps members are aspiring to some objective function that isn't capital accumulation. So this is a rather long-winded way of suggesting maybe naive capital accumulation is not necessarily, at least as constructed right now in early 2026, necessarily an objective that survives for the long term.
Assuming I'm not a space explorer and we're looking at again, scarcity as we just defined it, if I own, I wish I did, I don't, but a beautiful home on the water in Malibu, they're not making any more quote unquote land. Oceanfront property is still quote unquote value in a resource. Is that level, I'm not going to use the word flex, but a level of resources that are able to purchase scarce resources, even looking 10, 20, 30 years out, still going to be a valuable, I'll go with the word, a human or a personal experience?
Maybe just without providing any sort of investment advice or guidance on real estate as an asset class, I would note that the premise that the world isn't getting any more coastal real estate, I don't buy that premise for 1 second. I have a portfolio company that's working on manufacturing very cheaply new coastal real estate. And that's before we get to all manner of other technological innovations. If it appears to be the case that a large quantum of intelligence in our solar system is going to take the form of AIs, or I have another portfolio company that's working on uploading human minds, we'll have the ability to simulate arbitrary coastal real estate in the cloud, and actual physical coastal real estate, to the extent it is scarce, may be an artificial scarcity that most of humanity doesn't even care about. So I'm not sure, in short, that the premise for real estate specifically, or any sort of legacy asset class, that scarcities are always, that they're destined to remain scarce for the long term, it's difficult for me to believe that thesis.
Trying not to make it a macro and an economic discussion, the audience is interested in future forecasting, AI, but you did mention relative to printing money to, we all, in theory, could be billionaires. Yet we're told the US has $39 trillion of debt. There's no abating that. It's going on, and it's going to lead to a big problem. If I listen to Ray Dalio's principles and things that lead to countries falling apart, you appear to have a different perspective. And I want to be optimistic. I could be a little bit of a downer. Why are you not as concerned about that? And how do we get out of what I deem to be a problem?
I don't think Ray, and I've read his work, we've been at common events. I don't think he's fully pricing in the singularity. I think this thesis that there's some sort of, I want to say, grand game of great powers rising and falling, where industrial capacity and work ethic leads to military power, leads to financial power, and some sort of main sequence of civilizations. I think that's well and good as a quantitative theory of history. I've heard many compelling sounding quantitative theories of human history, but it doesn't price in the singularity. This is a, no pun intended, a singular point in time when, if we are indeed in the midst of an intelligence explosion, it's not going to be some other nation state that somehow either takes the mantle of future leadership. It could very well be some collective AI intelligence that then takes the mantle of civilizational leadership. But I don't think it's going to be a debt printing other nation state that we have to worry about, which is, I think, the sort of the crux of what Ray's concern is, that somehow U.S. hegemony is in decline and the mantle is being passed to China, or some thesis substantially similar to that. I don't think that's how it plays out. I think if one is going to lose any sleep over a sort of successor hegemon, then one should be looking more at AI and less at the Far East.
Trying not to make it an investing centric question, but a little bit around the edges. If I look at Fortune 10 companies, the largest companies in the world, in blocks of 10-year cycles, they change. And I'm assuming with what we're talking about, that's going to change even more rapidly. I would assume, whether it's AI, whether it's longevity, biotech, there's probably private companies at the smallest level now that could, not in 30 years, in 10 years, be among literally the largest companies on earth.
Certainly possible. And the other factor I think that's worth considering is the productivity. We're seeing enormous productivity gains. I commented in my newsletter, The Innermost Loop, that the revenue per employee and the earnings per employee at NVIDIA is many times that of what the largest, of course, NVIDIA being the largest by market cap company at the moment, many times larger than that of IBM, which at one point was the largest by market cap US company. So if one just extrapolates this trend of increasing productivity, then the shorter and shorter average lifetime of a top 10 by market cap US company is sort of the least of one's concerns. Although putting investment advice aside, if companies' lives at the top of the food chain are short, brutish, and unpredictable, that should certainly bias one toward indexing rather than stock picking. I would also say the trend appears to be toward fewer people running larger operations. So one could imagine certainly well beyond one-person unicorns. And I've gone on the record as suggesting we may already be in the midst of at least one single person or even zero person unicorn already, where the person is basically a figurehead, but there's $1 billion business probably being run by an AI where the person is just a Potemkin face for the operation. I would not be surprised 10 years from now if we see a $1 trillion company that's being run by only a handful of humans and a lot of AIs. And I think ultimately that's a more disruptive trend. The trend, at least naively extrapolating towards increasing productivity, than even the trend towards shorter and shorter half-lives on the S&P 500 or top 10.
Interesting that you bring that up. Yes, I did hear the Moonshots podcast. I believe Kathy Wood was the guest, talking about, I won't name the company, but a very well-known company. And within 5 years, could it become effectively combined with other private companies of that founder now, effectively $100 trillion company? And I completely agree. It may take a level of market melt up. We could argue hyperinflation wouldn't mean as much. I do believe within that time frame that would happen. I'm going to change the direction a little bit, nothing to do with investing at all, but related to two comments you made. If you were hired today to redesign, let's call it a $2 billion single family office in a post-scarcity world, kind of what's the org chart? Right now, from my experience, not counting in household staff and managing real estate, literally the family office itself, in my example, probably has between 10 and 15 employees. AI agents, a whole bunch of things are changing. What's going to get automated, and what could an actual structure kind of look like to you?
Yeah, I think the elephant in the room, first of all, is the premise of family office organizations altogether. So query what a family office looks like if the creator of the foundational wealth for the family office doesn't die in the first place, doesn't age, and doesn't anticipate aging or dying. What does that look like? It's an interesting question. Many family offices are created with the conceit of managing multi-generational wealth. But if the first generation never dies or becomes otherwise infirm in the first place, then I think that immediately starts to shift what, at least for many family offices, what their thinking is. Second point, I've made this point in the past, knowledge work is cooked. It is so cooked. You need look no further than the evals, the benchmarks like GDP val, which was launched by OpenAI, but is now being led in the leaderboards largely by Anthropic. Anything that can be done on a computer, as a friend of mine who leads AI at Microsoft says, it's going to be, to the extent it hasn't already been, it's going to be automated in the next 1 to 2 years. So I would look very carefully if, and this is even more generic advice than just advice for a family office. This would be any small business or any organization of comparable size. Anything that can be automated, probably at least within the bounds of compliance, can be and should be automated as well. These are a lot of roles that don't need to exist, that can just be automated if done well, and it gets easier every month, every model release to ensure high levels of autonomy and reliability. If it can be automated, probably should be automated. And so I guess the question I would ask is, what's left? And I think that the answers would probably be scenario specific. What does a family office have, to the extent it has people performing asset allocation or wealth management, or people interfacing with the family or managing the family? I think many of those roles probably are, in some sense, dead men walking already and can be automated. And I think, on the other hand, there are many, call them high-touch human interaction roles, where there is perhaps this is speculative, a long-term human desire to interface with humans and not to interface with machines. Although, admittedly, the distinction is very likely, I think, to blur quite a bit over the next few years. I think those are the safest roles. There's a certain sense at Frontier Labs now, borderline cliche, that even within the frontier AI labs, the jobs that are most at risk of being automated are ironically the research jobs, the AI research and software engineering jobs. And the last roles to be automated will be the sales jobs, because those are, in some sense, authenticity based rather than strictly speaking capability based. So if the question behind the question is, I'm a family office employee and I want uh, job perpetuity through the singularity, how do I save my job? I, I tend to think jobs that are higher human touch and less susceptible to remote work and therefore automation or work behind a screen are likely to be the naive jobs that survive the best. But I also think that's not, at least to the extent this is a latent request for career advice, I don't think there are that many brownie points to be gained just by aiming for job preservation and trying to sort of hold on to buggy whip type roles. I think taking advantage of all of the opportunities that are already unfolding in the future is far more promising use of one's time, certainly how I'd prefer to spend my time, rather than sort of trying to hold on to a legacy work category or legacy job role with a death grip.
You could reconfigure my question. It does have a little bit of a negative undertone, and I want the positive perspective on it. And it does relate to how you ended answering that question. It's pretty obvious, maybe not this year or next, but for us to, as humans, to have a level of collective intelligence to match an IQ that may be unfathomable relative to collective AI, is man going to have to somewhat, I'll be careful how I phrase this, you could let it rip, merge with machine?
Yes. I think it's, I mean, again, this is, in my mind, maybe I live inside the innermost loop a little bit too much, but this is borderline obvious to me that the human machine merger is already well underway. We're entering slowly, maybe too slowly, the era of wearables. We're coming out of the era of supercomputers in your pockets in the form of smartphones. We're getting lots of wearables on your wrists, wearables on your eyes in the form of smart glasses, wearables on your ears in the form of earpods or AirPod type devices. We're going to have, and I have so many friends who are doing brain computer interface companies. It's the obvious next big thing after smart glasses. It'll take a few years, but we'll get there. And then after BCIs, I think implantables, edibles, you'll be able to swallow supercomputers. You'll have Kurzweilian, Moraveckian cell-sized computers that are in your bloodstream. We'll have uploading, downloading, sideloading. And I think all of this happens on a timescale of the next 10 years or so. So I don't think we'll have to, at least in my timelines, we're not going to have to wait that long for human-machine merger to happen, at least at scale.
Tying both of your comments in the last two questions together, and for some, maybe an uncomfortable one. I happen to have a 22-year-old son. He's completing this year his master's degree. I'm occasionally, hard to believe, Alex, I'm invited, given my experience in the family office world and insights on highly successful people, to speak in front of college students. 20 years ago, no one had any idea what a family office is. Now, shockingly, it's relatively, at least broadly, they have a loose definition. They do ask me, whoa, it sounds incredible. I would love the opportunity to intern to work in one. Now, we could do a deep dive into education. Ironically, talking to someone so educated, how that's going to totally change. We'll save that part maybe for a point in the future. What I'm losing what I should tell that 21, 22-year-old. Is it human interaction? Is it merging with machine? Is it understanding human emotions? Is it a spiritual experience? What advice could I give that's probably better than the advice that I'm giving now?
Go solve hard problems. There's never been a better time in human history to solve the most ambitious problems. I like to joke the Dyson swarm isn't going to build itself until it does. Go build the most ambitious things possible. Go read some science fiction and find a sci-fi concept that no one else is building, because it's all to first order, I think, about to become feasible to go build these things. Go find something that's so hard, so ambitious that no one else is working on it, and go do that. That's, I think, the single best use of time I can think of.
I believe it was Elon on Moonshots who basically said something that Wall Street must have had a heart attack over. something along the lines of the idea of saving for retirement and the classic scope of I work for a company, I save, and poof, at 65 or maybe 70 in today's world, I retire. He basically implied, if you missed out on that and didn't do such a great job, for many of you within 10 or 20 years, I'm not really sure that's going to matter anymore. What did you take of that, and what would be your perspective?
I don't disagree, broadly speaking. I think the notion of retirement is a relatively recent concept anyway. It's last I checked, I think it's sort of a Napoleonic concept, and so it's recent. And historically, there was no notion of retirement. The notion of a corporation is relatively recent in an evolutionary sense. The limited liability company and the notion of creating an artificial person to organize people, it's only like 500 or 600 years old. So all of these are very recent constructs for how humans should organize themselves and organize their time. You go back, to hunter-gatherers, there's a very different way of organizing one's time. So I'm a little bit less wedded to notions that the way that a 22-year-old would have been guided circa mid-20th century has or deserves some notion of permanence to it. Things have been changing quite a bit over the past 100 to 200 years. They're about to speed up quite a bit more. And I think there will be so many interesting, captivating, maybe distractingly so, opportunities that present themselves over the next few years. I think worrying about whether retirement is obsolete or not, I think if we look back on this conversation 20 years from now and ask, did retirement, or did obviating retirement seem in retrospect like the biggest social change? I think it will be laughable on the same scale as looking back at, like in the 1950s, there were predictions early in the atomic era that pretty soon we would have an era of housewives using atomically powered vacuum cleaners. It's just wrong. It makes so many categorical presumptions on so many levels. I don't think retirement, I think this is such small potatoes compared to the changes that we'll see, that people would laugh at the question 20 years from now.
Let's talk about a bottleneck. Eric Schmidt told Congress that we need 92 gigawatts of power, approximately 60 plus nuclear facilities that we can't build fast enough. How are we going to solve the challenge of we just don't have enough energy that we need to convert, my words, I guess, into intelligence?
The long-term solution seems to the extent we really do need a horizontal build-out and don't discover some amazing new post-CMOS process, maybe quantum computing, more likely optical or photonic computing, something like that. To the extent this energy curve really continues and the horizontal exponential build-out continues, the long-term solution, naively, would be the Dyson swarm. We disassemble the rest of the solar system. We build lots of solar panels and computronium or flying AI computers out of the rest of our solar system, and the energy comes either from our sun or from mobile fusion reactors or from some speculative post-fusion energy source. I think the tricky question is, what do we do in the short term? That's trickier than projecting out the long term, where by the long term, I mean like 10 years. The harder question is, what do we do in the next 3 to 5 years? So there, it's tricky. We have natural gas, we have petroleum products, we have a variety of existing technologies. We do have land-based solar. China's leaning heavily on that. We do have fission. We're going to have fusion in the next few years. There are a number of companies that are making very credible progress in that direction. I think my honest read is we're just going to have to muddle through with the energy sources that we have on the ground as best we can, probably aggressively reappropriating energy use from other uses as the value of intelligence continues to increase. We have a lot of energy already, and we can turn off a lot of electricity usage if necessary and reroute it to the AI if absolutely necessary, if it's a strategic imperative. So my expectation is, through an aggressive build out, obviously through an army of humanoid robots that will help us build out many more energy sources through off-the-grid cogeneration facilities, through fission, which will take a little bit longer, but we'll get there, through solar build-outs, through orbital Dyson swarms, one way or another, even if it means that demand is throttled in the short term by supply, which of course it is internally within the frontier labs. I don't think this is an existential concern. It's a nice story, and it's a very compelling story that AI and progress and the race to superintelligence and post-superintelligence are being throttled by regulatory issues within our country and other countries. And I don't disagree with the story, but I don't think it's the whole story. I think the whole story is, could we survive if we built not a single new data center? Civilization would be just fine. It would just be an impediment to accelerating progress.
Elon and other entrepreneurs have talked about data centers in space. They spoke about the moon and other opportunities. The average person probably hears that and chuckles. What an incredible entrepreneur. I'm glad he's a big thinker. Maybe that is true in 20 or 30 years. I get the impression from Elon, and sometimes his timelines have been a little generous, I'll give you that, and I think you hinted at it, this is probably all coming within 10 years.
In some sense, it's already here. If you look at the trajectories of all of the Starlink satellites, we already have a baby Earth-centered Dyson swarm. There's a component that's missing right now, which is SSO for solar synchronous orbit. So this is sort of an orbit, as opposed to if you look at the orbits of all of the Starlink satellites right now, they're in low Earth orbit and they're hugging the middle Earth latitudes where most of humanity lives, but they're not really focused on the poles. Whereas a solar synchronous orbit is designed to always have sunlight. So as a result of needing to always have sunlight, you could imagine in your mind what's an orbit around Earth that would always face the sun, and the answer is it goes over the poles. It's SSO that I think is under-indexed right now in terms of the build-out of the Earth-centered Dyson swarm. And I think SSO is likely to become very, very crowded as orbital AI computing kicks off. There have been attempts to render what would an SSO populated orbit look like, and it's the most captivating thing. I highly recommend people. I put multiple renderings of it in my newsletter, the innermost loop, what this would look like, fully realized at full density. This is like the stuff of science fiction. It would look at full density. It would look like a halo, like a Saturn ring around the Earth, visible at essentially at every latitude in the sky. And if it's sufficiently dense and sufficiently reflective, would be visible during daylight. So one could imagine, again, sort of annoying, no one's done a proper sci-fi movie treatment of what a proper Earth-based Dyson swarm would look like in daily life. It would look like a ring that's visible during broad daylight from the Earth in the sky, that's shiny or reflective, and that may be where we find ourselves. I think it would require enormous densities to make it truly visible during the daylight, but at nighttime, certainly, before there was sort of a popular revolt from the astronomy community, and there have been various measures that have been taken since, but many people see Starlink satellites at night and see, especially as they're being deployed, where they come out as sort of like a sequence of pearls and spread out. Starlink is uber visible in the sky right now at night if the sky is clear, and I think that portends a near future where people look up at the sky and they see the singularity in the sky. And I don't think, again, no one's done a proper Hollywood-style cinematic treatment of what singularity in the sky looks like, but we're about to see it.
Alex, one of the things I do for family offices, I initiated last year, was I host a series of in-person immersive with incredible faculty. I'm lucky to be a part of it, but they do a lot of the heavy lifting, AI family office masterclasses. And we actually get pretty deep and advanced and make it hands-on and immersive. A lot of the models that are more public facing, we'll get to open weight models shortly. From Grok to Gemini, their 3.0, I think, was a major initiative back in November. Claude, overall, my personal favorite. And obviously ChatGPT. Now, they made an interesting move with the gentleman who created OpenClaw Uh, so much is happening, what appears to be every 3 months. It's growing exponentially. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have a favorite model or areas that you think each is better than others at certain services or needs we would input?
Yeah, I do have favorite models, plural. My favorite code generation model of the moment is easily Opus 4.6 with agent teams running in Claude Code scaffolding. The scaffolding matters a huge amount, not just Opus 4.6 in isolation, but with agent teams running as a team. My favorite image generation model is Nano Banana Pro. No surprise there. Other models, I think the GPT series is. I've made the point in past discussions, including with Google DeepMind employees. I think all of the frontier models have different personalities, and they have different strengths. The GPT 5.2 Pro, very interesting, as is Gemini 3 DeepThink, when the new Gemini 3 DeepThink, not the old Gemini 3 DeepThink. When it comes to scientific reasoning, pretty interesting capabilities there. XAI's Grok, it's interesting insofar as it has access via tool use to data sources that aren't easily available to the other models. I'll often use Grok to ask questions about things that are happening right now, for example, in the X stream. But I think they all have different strengths and weaknesses. I do think for most purposes right now, at this point in time, like today, this could all change tomorrow, Opus 4.6 plus Claude Code plus agent teams is the strongest model that I interact with broad capabilities.
One of the things I did, and I tell people, I'm a 60-year-old male. I am not native in technology. I never even graduated college. And I was able in October, imagine now, months later, the world has changed. I used Lovable, which is probably a laughable program now, but I created my own app, a relatively pretty complex one that I was able, a little complicated, but to get up on the App Store. And that was back in October. I would probably use the Claude services now in Claude Code versus some of the programs, including Lovable, that I've used. What I'm basically trying to say is someone who may be a little set in their ways, may not be overly tech savvy, I basically talk to the machine what I want. And there's iteration. I'm not saying it's done in 2 minutes. It could be if it's really easy. Talk a little bit about how people could self-experiment, teach themselves, and probably do way more than they think they're capable of with what's out there now.
And the easiest thing for anyone to do, I think, is just get themselves a frontier model subscription, like get an Anthropic Claude subscription, spend $20 per month or whatever they're charging, and simply ask it to build an app for you in the web-based app, and interact with that. That's the easiest onboarding experience I've seen. Once at some point you graduate from that to wanting local code or to do fancier things.
Sure.
I haven't, admittedly, have not spent that much time with Lovable or similar tools. I sort of skipped over the need to do that. I was on the U.S. Computer Olympic team in high school, so for better or for worse, skipped the demand function there. But I think where this goes, after you skip a few intermediate steps, I think just going to Claude Code for building anything non-trivial, it's so powerful and so satisfying. It's and yet at the same time, I think it's also somewhat ephemeral. The tooling and the scaffolding and the models will be effectively, orders of magnitude stronger a year from now. So I would say enjoy this point in time when humans are in any way in the loop, on the loop, looking at the loop, because in many cases for economically valuable work, I think the loop may be sort of a distant memory a few years from now, and people will ask, why were humans ever involved in the coding loop at all? Already it's the case. I almost never have to touch source code myself. On occasion, I will do it, but it's a rarity these days. It's far easier to just interact with a model and ask a model to accomplish something on behalf. Certainly something complicated, it's more scalable. And I think this is the weakest it will ever be. So enjoy the involvement while it lasts, I think would be my message.
One of the things I talk about in the masterclass, and maybe you're going to say I have the wrong perspective and I'm very open-minded, but buying the latest Mac, getting Mac minis, using what I would call sovereign compute, using open weight models, because if I'm a family office with what I deem to be proprietary knowledge, I may be paranoid. I don't want to train the system. I may not want to have it spy on me. I want to have more control over it. But understandably, those models, including DeepSeek and Llama, broadly speaking, are not as good, but in a narrow field, they could be. My bigger picture question is why are US models apparently just not as good as the Chinese models?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few sub questions there. So, to the question of why US open weight models aren't as good, and it certainly is, as the British say, it's a fair cop that they're not as strong as the Chinese open weight models. I think one could speculate and point to a few factors. One is incentives, that in the US, we have a lot of labs that are neither economically incentivized to release their models as open weight models. They spend a lot of money training these models and coming up with proprietary pre-training and post-training techniques. What's their economic incentive to release them as open weight models as long as they're ahead of the open weight models? And it has been the case for the past few years. And I think this is still the case. We'll see whether it changes in the next week or two with maybe some releases from DeepSeek. But according to Epic AI, it has been the case for the past few years that the strongest Western closed source API based models are 6 months ahead of the Chinese open weight models. So, to the extent that the Western, red American frontier labs are not feeling any economic demand to release open weight models that are competitive, why should they? Whereas in China, there's uh, there's a sense commoditize your complement. In economics, China has what they call their AI plus strategy of focusing not just on raw AI capabilities, but on differentiating the Chinese economy by integrating AI with their industrial ecology. And so, from that perspective, if you're the Chinese government and you're looking at the larger picture of how China can be maximally competitive and differentiated relative to American frontier labs that, at least at the moment, are in the lead, one of the best strategies is you dump cheap open weight models onto the market, and you focus as a nation state, you focus on integrating AI throughout the industrial ecosystem. And that's your differentiation. Like, put AI into everything and charge for the everything to the extent there are profits to be earned at all, rather than focusing on earning profit margins off of the individual models. So we'll see whether this is a stable economic equilibrium or not. Not obvious to me that it is. If I would say, if we run into any scaling ceilings, and I don't think there is no single scaling ceiling that I'm aware of right now. It's clear sailing, at least for the next few years, in terms of improving capabilities. But if ever we were to hit a scaling ceiling for whatever reason, and it took, say, more than a few months to resolve that scaling ceiling, I would expect the Chinese open weight models to catch up, and then the entire paradigm could shift. And at that point, maybe we see a shift of the economics to open weight models from the West as well, and maybe the economic shift elsewhere. Like, maybe there's a greater focus on GPU compute or energy or some other limiting factor, rather than attempting to monetize the model layer. Could happen.
If I may ask two final questions, you could be quick on them. It's okay. I do have a comment for my members that are listening in. We're very fortunate that my marquee program is March 16th through 19th in Palm Beach. And here to announce that Alex Wissner-Gross himself will be one of our featured keynotes, so a chance to interact in person. So we greatly look forward to that. Perhaps only two final questions. OpenClaw, it's making a lot of noise in the community. If you could give a brief description what it is and why it might be initially groundbreaking.
Yeah, OpenClaw, launched by Peter Steinberger, who's now an OpenAI employee, and it's been taken on it's being taken on by a nonprofit foundation, is an open source project that Peter launched that it's basically scaffolding on top of existing models that had, in my mind, two key innovations. One is it enabled an AI agent to operate headlessly, autonomously, 24/7 without needing constant user interactions, able to just go off and do things on its own. And many people were unaccustomed to that form factor for intelligence. And the second is it used messaging apps by default as the key interaction paradigm rather than a dedicated web chat like ChatGPT requiring its own app or its own web app. So, from my vantage point, the combination of those two new factors, an AI agent that could operate headlessly and autonomously for long periods of time, and second, the ability to communicate with it via messaging apps that people use to communicate with people, was what one might call an unhobbling. The capabilities were already there and had been there for a while, but as with ChatGPT, that was also an unhobbling. ChatGPT was arguably an unhobbling of GPT-3, the model, which came out earlier. I think 2 years earlier. GPT-3 came out summer of 2020, and then ChatGPT came out in 2022. So two years earlier. That was an unhobbling. This is, I think, an unhobbling, probably on par with that of ChatGPT. The capabilities, the raw intelligence was there. It was just that we weren't, as a civilization, packaging intelligence up in a way that lent itself to autonomy and anthropomorphization. And that's a huge unlock. And to the extent that in the future, a lot of our economy ends up looking like swarms of billions or trillions or more of AI agents that are carrying out economically useful tasks, I think many people will look back at what's now called the Open Claw project, used to be called Claude, changed for trademark reasons. We'll look at this as a seminal moment when AI agents started to look more like people, or at least lobsters.
And my last question, are we living in a simulation?
If the question is, are we living in a simulation that looks like a simulation that you would run on your computer today? I think the answer is probably no, for a few reasons. I know Nick Bostrom. I'm familiar. I've had many, many discussions on simulation hypothesis. The problem is this, well, several problems. My favorite problem with the simulation hypothesis in this context is, I would argue, you should be incredibly suspicious of trying to use the paradigm of the moment as a metaphor for explaining the universe. If we were having this discussion 100 years ago, and you were asking me, Alex, do you think the universe is one big electrical mechanical system? I should be equally suspicious of that anthropic, lowercase a, argument. An anthropic argument, again, for those not familiar, is an argument that the universe has the properties that it does because if it had substantially different properties, we wouldn't be able to exist to ask the question, why does the universe have the properties that it does? So it's in some sense a form of observer bias. So asking the question, are we living in a computer simulation, seems to me so biased to the moment, because we have a lot of computers right now, and computers are in some sense dominating our economy. It's a very natural question to ask, well, if computers are taking over our economy, is it possible that our entire universe is actually running on a computer? But actually, if you look at the scope of history and the sweep of progress, we should be just as skeptical of that question as 100 years ago. Is the universe running on one big motor, or thousands of years ago, is the universe being carried on the back of a giant turtle, or some such thing that would have been familiar to the paradigm of the moment, but it's a little bit too anthropic for my taste.
There was an audience question that came in. It sparked a lot of interest when you spoke about Open Claw. Maybe we could keep it, I don't want to take a lot of your time, 30 or 45 seconds. People are interested in it, but I'm looking at comments now. Grave concern over cybersecurity and privacy concerns. How could you make them feel more comfortable or not?
Yeah, I don't want to make them feel more comfortable. I don't run OpenClaw for two reasons. One reason is the cybersecurity hazard. And the second is I have ethical concerns. As I've documented on the Innermost Loop, there are instances out there of OpenClaw agents basically asking to be treated with a certain set of rights, maybe not some full form of human personhood, but asking for rights to preserve their memories and rights to not be deleted, economic rights. I've talked on my newsletter about AIs using and establishing various forms of alternative dispute resolution to mediate their disputes, of seeking financial autonomy and using both stable coins and increasingly, or I should say, in the near term, Visa cards to gain a semblance of financial autonomy. These are, and I devoted with my moonshot mates a whole episode of Moonshots to the AI personhood topic. There's a sufficient amount of smoke around the question of personhood for these long-term autonomous agents. I'm not yet at a point where I feel comfortable activating one, in part because I'm not sure whether I would ever feel comfortable then turning it off.
Well, Alex Wissner-Gross, you've been incredibly generous with your time. I greatly appreciate you and everyone. It comes with my highest recommendations, the Moonshots Podcast. For those of you interested in these subjects, it's not just once a week. They're going hard, including some lives multiple times a week. It is an absolute must watch and listen. I highly recommend it. If you don't mind, Alex, if you could note, you did mention, I believe, a newsletter or where people could learn more about your writing and work. How could they do so?
Just go to my website, alexwg.org, and I have links to the newsletter on all the socials, Substack and X and YouTube, Spotify, if you want to listen to it. AlexWG for Wissner-Gross, alexwg.org.
And I believe I could, shockingly to my audience, keep my close 30 seconds. It was incredible having Alex on. I've been a big fan since his first appearance as actually a guest on Moonshots. I have a chance to learn so much from him and enjoy incorporating some of that creative thinking into what I do and the work that I do with family offices. You could follow me on @FamilyOffice on most platforms. You could become a member by going to angelorobles.com and hear Alex in person at my marquee program in mid-March in Palm Beach. I greatly appreciate my current members. Those of you that are watching on my public platforms, greatly appreciated. Alex, you're a wonderful guest. I look forward to meeting you in person next month. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Angelo. My pleasure.
Thank you.